come to you in the name of one God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. If you all are feeling anything like I am, you've hit about your saturation limit for hate in the world. Yeah. And I believe that while we are looking out at a certain amount of hateful responses out in this world, in our country, toward one another, when so often, when faced with challenge or difference, when we see that the response is to turn toward hatred. And I've reached about my tolerance level for that, which is exactly those kinds of moments when I come to church, looking for some comforting words from Jesus. Come on, Jesus. And what we hear is Jesus telling us that we are to hate our families, our fathers, our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, our children, even our children, in order to follow him. Now, I am going to do our best to make sense of that momentarily, but it's going to take me a minute to get there. And in order to get there, I need to start with talking about prepositions. And prepositions are important. It makes a difference when we are talking about, for example, I'm going to go take out the trash for grandma, or I'm going to go take out the trash to grandma. Changes the meaning. And rather than just being a semantic discourse, I think taking a moment to study that's going to help us to understand how can we grow closer to being the disciples God calls us to be, and whether in fact we do need to hate our families in order to be good disciples. So here it goes. I studied for a short while under a great pastor and teacher, Peter Stenke. Peter Stenke, that's S-T-E-I-N-K-E, Stenke. Peter Stenke was a Lutheran minister as well as the director of the Center for Healthy Congregations, where he developed and taught all around the country the idea of what he called natural systems. Now, natural systems was developed going all the way back to the 1950s from a psychologist named Murray Bowen. Murray Bowen studied what he at the time was calling family systems, and it was the understanding that families ultimately function as a certain kind of a system, and all of the people in it and how they relate to one another are a system, and there's certain trends that he observed that are common from family to family. One of them, you probably observe a lot of these in your families, the way things tend to get handed down. Who here has found themselves parenting their children and finding themselves thinking, my goodness, I am saying and doing exactly what my parents did? Or maybe finding yourself saying, I am doing exactly the opposite of what my parents did. Either way, it's an effect of how it gets handed down. Other observations that Bowen made were the idea of fusion and cutoff, this idea that it's important for a family to have certain beliefs that we must have in common in order to unite us. And that if we don't have certain beliefs in common, that often the result can be cut off, either estrangement, disownment, divorce, and that we tend to go toward either fusion or cutoff. Another one of those is triangling. If you've heard of people talking about triangling one another, that's that idea of whenever you have two people in a relationship, there's always a tendency to draw in a third. You tend to see that kind of thing most acutely when you see, this person is making me anxious. Please, you go change them so I don't feel this way. Making a triangle. Those are family systems. About a generation later, there was a rabbi named Ed Friedman. Ed Friedman was the person who looked at congregations and said that congregations, churches like us, in a lot of ways function that same way that families function as a system. And we can see a lot of those same kinds of trends. You all know what it's like when we do something because it's the way it was handed down to us. We've always done it that way. You all know what it's like. when we say there are certain beliefs that are so important to us that these are the things that hold us together, that make us strong with one another. But that if it's taken too far, that fusion can turn into the you must believe what I tell you to believe or else you're not welcome here. That's always the danger, leading to cutoff. And of course, every once in a while, we do still have some triangling going on where we say, so-and-so is making me feel bad. Please go change them so I don't feel this way. Those same kinds of systems appear in congregations that appear in families. It's into that sense that Dr. Stanke, wrote about society at large. All societies, families, congregations, our society out in our world. We have healthy functioning and unhealthy functioning. Fusion can be a good thing. It can be the kind of thing that holds us together and makes us strong. It can be the kind of thing that leads us to say, you need to follow my will or else you aren't worthy of being loved. And what makes the difference between that sort of healthy functioning and that unhealthy functioning in the system? Stanke would say, it depends on how you are defining who am I responsible for and who am I responsible to. That's those prepositions. Who am I responsible for? And who am I responsible to in this world? And Dr. Stanke would say that going back to our very creation, the people we were made to be, we were made to be people who are responsible for ourselves. Responsible for being the people we're called to be. Responsible for doing what we know we should. Responsible for following the vows that we have made. I am responsible for me. And I am responsible to God and God's people, God's creation. I'm responsible to treat God's creation in the way that God would want it to be treated, with love, with compassion. And that so many of the problems that we run into in this world are when we flip those prepositions. When we find ourselves in a place where we're being responsible to ourselves and responsible for others, flipping it over. You think about the story of Cain and Abel. In one of the earliest stories in the Old Testament, the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills his brother Abel, God comes to him and says, "Where is your brother?" And Cain's response is, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Demonstrating he's got those flipped, he's got them reversed. The only thing Cain is seeing himself responsible to is himself. Responsible for my brother? I'm going to say, I'm not responsible for that. And what we see is one of the very first moments, as we say in our history, of a sin committed outside of the Garden of Eden, the very first thing that results in the death of one of God's creatures, one of human creatures, is because Cain has confused the difference between who he is responsible for and who he is responsible to. That's what Stanke would say is the problem we are facing out in the world that leads to all of the unhealthy functionings in our systems and society. I think it's what we're seeing happening in the letter from Paul to Philemon. Paul, writing to his friend Philemon, who has a slave named Onesimus. And Onesimus has become a Christian. Paul wants him freed and says to Philemon, you need to set your brother free. And this is the moment where Philemon is given the opportunity to flip those prepositions. Because up to this point, Philemon's thinking, I'm responsible to myself. What's good for me? Because what's good for me is to keep my slave. I'm responsible for making sure that Onesimus does what I want. Bend him to my will so that he serves my goals, what's important to me. And Paul is asking him to flip those around. Because if Philemon suddenly starts thinking of himself as responsible for himself and who he is called to be, and responsible to Onesimus and how he should treat his brother, he has to set him free. So it's in that sense that I turn to Jesus and our gospel for today. Jesus, who does absolutely say to his disciples that you need to be able to hate your mother and your father and your children and your siblings in order to be my disciple. He does say this. But we also know that this is the same Jesus who believes in honoring your father and your mother, the great commandment of honor your father and your mother. We know this is the same Jesus who believes in honoring and loving little children, loving your family, loving your brother and your sister, your neighbor as yourself. We know that on the one hand, Jesus is saying you have a responsibility to love these people, and you need to hate these people. So what helps me with that cognitive dissonance in the moment, Jesus didn't use it in these words, but what helps me in that moment is thinking about it as a conundrum of who are you called to be responsible for and who are you called to be responsible to? Because if you are responsible for your family, it's going to hold you back. You absolutely are responsible to them, to love them, to cherish them, to be there for them, to be the family member that they need you to be to them. But you're not responsible for who they are. They are responsible for who they are. And you are responsible for who you are and who you are called to be. And Jesus knows that he's telling people to do something that will be very hard sometimes, because it's very easy for us to slip into that pattern of feeling like we are responsible for who others are, what they do, and controlling that so that it is bent to our will and not being responsible to anything but ourselves. And so I think it's in that sense that Jesus is giving them a very stark message. Beware of who you are responsible for and who you are responsible to. That's how I make sense of that dissonance. And we have that work to do because we live in a world where it is filled with people being responsible to no one but themselves. What's good for them, what they want, and trying to do their utmost to be responsible for everyone around them. Do what I say or else you're not welcome here. Do what I do or else you're not worthy of being loved. You have to not just make the cut, you have to make my cut. And the world is filled with that. And it's important because we have the opportunity, I would say we have the duty to be different here. We have the duty here to be people who make sure we have those prepositions in the right order, that we are a church, St. James, who are responsible for ourselves, for who we are called to be, for the vows we have made, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to seek and serve Christ in all people, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and to look out and say, who are we responsible to out in the world? Because there's a lot of people out in the world who feel pretty alone or hungry or afraid, people who are in danger, and we have a responsibility to them. We here at St. James are a place where we believe in the importance of keeping our doors open in this world as an important symbol that anyone can see. You can come through here and you are safe here. You are welcome here. This is a place where there is darkness out in that world, where there are those who are putting others in danger. There is darkness out in this world, and we are called to be a light to them. There is coldness out in this world, and we are called to be the warmth. There's hunger out there, and we are called to feed people in body, mind, and spirit. And when we do that work with one another as a community, when we do that work with one another as a community in the days to come, we are an outward sign to everybody else, to anybody else out in the world who is confused about the difference about who they're responsible for and who they're responsible to. We show that we know. We disciples, we children of God, we people of St. James, we are responsible for ourselves. And we are responsible to those who need us out in the world. Amen.